But yeah, I wanted to share some context about the focus area. Okay, so getting into this map that you see here, which represents the land ownership in the area, and again, to help us stay oriented and focus on the project, we wanted to reshare this visual. You all have seen this before about our area of focus south of 8th Street. So this visioning initiative is for the whole area dotted in black, right? And we've been hired by OCRA, the Oklahoma City Redevelopment Authority, and OCURA, the Oklahoma City Urban Renewal Alliance, to give guidance on their properties that they own south of Northeast 8th Street, which are the properties in this navy blue color that you see here on your screen. And this plan that we're collaborating on together, again, in working with OCURA and OCRA, is going to have the most influence over the properties that they own, that OCURA owns, which again are the properties in navy blue. It's also important to recognize how the additional properties that you see in your screen in the different colors that you see that represent those different properties are owned by private property owners and entities in the area. And if they choose to follow this vision, it's their choice to follow that vision. And so our influence is going to be most impactful to the OCURA owned lots. And throughout the project, we've been able to connect with different property owners and entities in the area to have discussions and share the work that we're doing. So we'll be able to talk more about that at later sessions and when we have more information to share. And we are also looking at the whole area, and just to be able to take the context into consideration about the surrounding area and the neighborhoods. But I just wanted to give that reminder of the focus and the influence that this visioning plan will have specifically to the OCURA owned lots on the map that you see. And getting into land use, the zoning, as we've discussed, is being updated in the area to align with the Innovation District Land Use Plan, as we've discussed. And the general urban land use designation in this brown color on the map that you see is the predominant land use typology in the area. And moving on to the next slide. And the general urban land use typology describes areas that are made up of primarily horizontal, mixed residential and commercial uses in a variety of building forms, which you can see examples of on the screen on the right side of your screen here, and what that looks like. And so today we want to talk about what those mixes can look like in the area and go over different topics related to commerce, housing, and retail, and how that development can look in Northeast OKC. All right, getting into urban programming to kick us off. So urban programming is a term that we use to describe the activities and uses in a specific area. And commerce and retail and housing are just some of the aspects or elements, if you will, that make up programming in a complete, fully serviced neighborhood area. Some of the other elements that are included in making up a complete neighborhood that you see here on your screen are spaces such as schools, cultural spaces, recreational spaces, and more that again create a neighborhood where people can not only live, but have joy and experience a high quality of life. And here are some picture examples that we are very familiar with here locally and some nationally. In our beloved Ralph Ellison Library that we're all familiar with in Washington Park, among other examples, again, that add to the complete programming of a neighborhood and bring in services and assets that serve a community. So we've discussed a little bit about the context of the area, kind of refocus and oriented ourselves about the focus area and the land use typology that's allowed in the area and the elements of a complete neighborhood. Now we're going to transition into specifically what is commerce, what is retail, and how that connects to neighborhood development. So commerce is generally defined as the activity of buying and selling, especially on a larger scale, while retail can be described as the sale of goods to the public in relatively smaller quantities for use or consumption. So I know we're all familiar with different examples and models of what commerce and retail looks like, maybe a little too familiar in some cases. So areas in commerce such as your big box stores like your Targets, your Walmarts, and shopping malls, and then retail through locally owned businesses. And then we have varying other different commerce and retail types based on various different scales, such as convenience stores, restaurants, food trucks and food truck parks, grocery stores. Some of these spaces are integrated together, so you might have a mix of a restaurant in retail, and more, and just kind of showing different examples of that. And when we think about the current state of commerce in retail, it's important to acknowledge how times have changed, as we all know, and technology has made advances at what seems to be at the speed of light that have created these trends and what is now effective and sustainable as it relates to commerce and retail in neighborhood spaces and just in practices in general. So trends that we're all familiar with, such as e-commerce and digital platforms like Amazon and other online retailers that have completely changed the game and how we shop and access goods for our households. Also, COVID-19, the pandemic, has created completely different models of operations that businesses have had to just really strategically and innovatively adapt to navigate the evolving constraints that the pandemic has caused, such as curbside pickup operations, delivery services, and more. And another really important trend that we're seeing in commerce and retail specifically is this experience-based retail or experience-based commerce that focuses on not just the product that you're purchasing or the services that you're purchasing, but what is that experience like for the customer, and how does that look like? So we're seeing a lot of experience-based business practices emerge. And here are just a few examples of some of those experience-based retail spaces. And it's really awesome to kind of see this because it's really how local businesses are competing against these e-commerce platforms that have really taken over, because they can create an experience that an online ordering process or e-commerce cannot provide because it's not in person and it doesn't have that social component to it. So these retail options and experience also can bring and create joy and connection in neighborhoods, and creates these gathering spaces where people can come together, socialize, bond, grow deeper connections to their neighborhood spaces, and just come together. And so here are some examples that we are highlighting here. At the top, we see the Apple Store, right? I think we're all pretty familiar with Apple, even if you're not an Apple user, Team Apple. I think we all can recognize the power and the experience retail that they've created, commerce that they've created in their store. And when I go to the mall, it's crazy to see the line outside of the Apple Store, and even people who are not even necessarily purchasing products will still wait in line to go into the Apple Store just to hang out or just to try products or look at different phones and different devices. So that's a really big example that I think we're all familiar with. Also, at the bottom right of the screen is Fulton Street Books and Coffee, which is a local shop in Tulsa that has created this experience centered on Black literature, coffee, small bites, in a nice cozy environment. So not just going to a place to get a book and leave, but there's actually a space where you can kind of hang out, connect, and connect to culture as well. And then there's this example of a space called Sunset Park in Brooklyn that has a mixed restaurant concept. So they have a restaurant and they also have this green garden space. So customers can come and eat, have fun, and also connect to nature and just be outside and enjoy the nature space while enjoying a meal while at it. So these are all examples of how just some of many businesses are really competing and trying to create these fun experiences, and also how they really create and add value to a neighborhood space. And as we've covered, commerce and retail, again, just really helps foster these deep community connections. And because they create spaces for neighbors to come together and share experiences, they are vital to the quality of life in a neighborhood. Many of us, I know, are familiar with the magic of going to the barbershop or the salon and having that experience, and how important these spaces are to the community, not just to go get your hair done or get fresh, but to have, again, these community connections And a lot of spaces, neighborhoods where these types of spaces exist, they're even the cornerstone of the community and where people come together for support and connection and various different social connections while getting a haircut. So really, really important to the viability of a neighborhood. Also, commerce and retail is critical to revitalization, which is a big theme in what we're doing in this visioning project together. And it helps create opportunities such as jobs, brings access to amenities for residents and neighbors. It helps create opportunities for business owners to come in, own businesses, cultivate wealth, and all while, again, just helping stimulate the revitalization of a neighborhood while attracting new residents and really helping to retain existing ones so people feel like they don't have to move away to have better access to what they need or have, live next to something fun that can have it all right in their neighborhood. And when you live near things that you can just walk to and experience and have fun, it just makes life a little bit easier. Did anyone grow up, you can chat in the chat or yell it out here in person, but did anyone grow up or does anyone live near a shop or a store or just a commercial area that they can walk to from their home? Does anybody? You do? You said
I
yes
do.
first? Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, so it just makes life better. And here are some examples on the slide on Northeast 23rd of different retail options that have been developed. We are all, I'm sure, familiar with these spaces, and they have brought in services and retail options for the surrounding community to enjoy. All right. So now that we have like a stronger or refreshed understanding of the importance of commerce and retail being integrated into a neighborhood and kind of having that discussion, it's really important to also acknowledge the role that housing plays into the ability for businesses to move into a neighborhood or near a neighborhood and vice versa. And in order to recruit and attract commerce and retail, density is needed to support it. And I know these are conversations we've kind of had throughout our engagement process, and we'll dive deeper in today. And when density in a neighborhood is low or too sprawled out, it can make it very, very difficult for businesses to come to an area and survive. So it creates a barrier for business owners to come into a neighborhood, especially locally owned businesses that are smaller, may not have the super big budgets or infrastructure or brand visibility. It's difficult for them to be able to come into a neighborhood when the density is low. So when density is low and when businesses can't come to an area, it also adversely impacts neighborhoods. All right, so we're going to discuss the role of housing in this context and how retail, commerce, and housing are all super interconnected and are needed to collectively support a complete neighborhood. All right, so getting into housing typologies, here on the screen are some historic maps that show a range of building types in Northeast OKC. Here, as we've had in previous discussions, we see a lot of density. And we've also spoken about in previous sessions, just like the density and how it created opportunities for multiple different building types, such as commercial buildings, single family homes, multi-family homes, and spaces like even apartment garages. And here is a graphic that I know some of us are familiar with, and it's from the Missing Middle Housing book, which is commonly used. This graphic is used a lot to reference and show different housing types. And missing middle housing is essentially what really has been an emergent practice that is deemed by many people as a best practice that is a range of house scale buildings that are compatible in scale and form with detached single family homes. And these missing middle buildings are unique because not only are they on sort of like the single family scale and style of design, but they have multiple units within them and they are located in walkable neighborhoods. And this model is becoming increasingly popular, especially for neighborhoods trying to revitalize because it's affordable by design, meaning that it achieves affordable price points for rental or for sale units without subsidies, by using simple, lower cost construction practices and methods and reducing the reliance of car ownership because they're in walkable communities. And these factors result in an end product that just makes it more affordable and attainable for households. So you see in this picture a range of different housing typologies, and in the missing middle category, you can see how the design of these homes in the missing middle category look and complement single family style homes, but they have multiple units within them, versus a mid-rise building that you see on your screen that's clearly an apartment building that may not complement the styles of a single family neighborhood as easily. And allowing for these types of options to bring in density and complement the character styles of the neighborhood, and also bring in affordable living options, gives neighborhoods an accessible alternative to revitalize their spaces while providing housing opportunities for various socioeconomic statuses. So it helps promote diversity, affordability, and brings in more density to a neighborhood while also complementing and respecting that single family style type of home. Right, and so here are some examples of different housing types in Northeast OKC that I'm sure we've all seen. You have your single family, and then your duplex and townhouse sort of development, multifamily development, and then higher densities here as well. We see on the screen a fourplex, a stacked fourplex, multiplex, and that's, again, you can see it still has like that single family kind of look, but multiple units in it, and creates opportunities for affordable living, home ownership, or rental opportunities. And then it's also important to acknowledge how bringing in density and mixed uses creates opportunities where people can live and work right in their neighborhoods. Who has a commute that's over 20 minutes? Anybody? Y'all are lucky. Oh, wow. I have a 30-minute commute every day. It is not fun. And on my way home, usually it's 45 minutes to an hour. So you guys are really fortunate. So this creates an opportunity where people can work, live, and play in their neighborhoods, and again, increases quality of life. And this is an example that you see on your screen of a vertical mixed use development that has commercial at the bottom and housing at the top. And again, creates the opportunity for someone to live and work in one place. Erin, I know you have a 30-minute commute because you're coming from home. Oh, I was supposed to say, don't leave me hanging. I know, we do the same. We're opposite. We're going to Norman, coming from Norman. Okay. Here, yeah, we make it. We love our job. We love our work, so it's worth it. But wouldn't it be nice if you could just walk to work? Wouldn't that be so nice? All right.
I like riding my bike, find an office.
Yes, bike. I'll do a bike. Not in this cold though, but yeah. All right, and then other types, we have ADUs here, accessory dwelling units, also known as in-law or mother-in-law suites or apartments. And these are self-contained residential units that are located on a property that has a separate main single-family or multi-family residential unit. And then I'm sure many of us have seen over the years this emerging tiny home model, which advocates for downsizing living spaces while essentially living with less. And this is an example of a really cool project happening at a nonprofit organization called Pivot to help make housing more accessible to kids who are aging out of the foster care system. So a really cool project there. All right, so housing financial structure slide, which I'm hoping that we're going to hear more about from speakers on our panel, but there are various different financial mechanisms used to provide certain types of housing, and such as affordable housing and public housing, as well as market rate and land trusts that help kind of create these opportunities for different housing types that align with socioeconomic statuses. And so we're going to talk a little bit about two here. All right, so here we see an example of a community investment trust development and a community land trust development on our screen. And a community land trust, also known as a CLT, is a structure that allows land to be held in trust for community needs outside the influence of market pressures. So it sort of protects the land from being skewed, the price or the amount being skewed by the market pressures. So in a classic CLT, an independent community controlled entity owns the land and takes care of that land, making sure it's being used in ways that support and honor the surrounding neighborhood. And a community investment trust is defined, or also known as a CIT, as a low dollar loss protected investment opportunity for community members. And through the CIT model or community investment trust model, community members have the opportunity to collectively invest and build equity in a thriving and diverse commercial property. So we have two examples here. The one on the left is the East Portland Community Investment Trust example. And this is a commercial site that was chosen for investment due to its proximity to other community resources such as churches, schools, libraries, transportation opportunities, and more, and the diversity of the neighborhood. And the other example is called Africa Town Community Land Trust, and this is based in Seattle, and it's actually really cool. And I encourage everyone to kind of look into this model because it has similar conditions. The area has similar conditions to Northeast OKC. And so this building that you see here on your screen is the Liberty Bank building, and was Africa Town's first of multiple endeavors in affordable development. And it also has affordable housing, which was marketed to the Black community, which in this area experienced significant loss and displacement. So the bottom floor is reserved for commercial space in this example, for Black-owned businesses, as well as helps to create the wealth building opportunities that have been stripped away from this community due to challenges that have happened historically. So what are the positive aspects of density? I'm going to go ahead and get into that. But first I want to talk about some of the myths that make it difficult, or sort of, kind of make some confusion around like what is density or what is multifamily housing and how does it impact a neighborhood. So one of the myths that we hear often are that multifamily developments and higher density, causes are inherently just causes, higher crime. That's definitely a myth that we hear a lot. And usually, especially as it relates to multifamily housing, this data is very skewed or not truly representative of what's actually happening because of the practice of reporting stats being based on the count of police calls by address. But if you live in an apartment complex that has, let's say, for example, 100 plus units, and at the same address, you might be in a different address as a single family residence, you might be wrongly compared to a single family residence versus a address that has an apartment complex with 100 units. So it gives the impression that there's more crime happening at the apartment complex, and that's not necessarily the case. It just looks skewed because there's more units in a specific area. There's also a myth that density in multifamily housing inherently causes a burden on school districts. However, with apartment style living, typically that type of housing is more attractive to single people, couples without children, or empty nesters. Not saying other families don't live in, or other sort of people that, family makeups don't live in apartment complexes. We know that they do, but typically this housing that's not the primary clientele of this kind of housing. And so usually the populations that were described, the empty nesters, the couples, and people who are just aging out of these larger single family homes, they don't have school age children. So that's not always the case. And then another myth that we hear is that it hurts or harms or lowers home values. But actually, according to the US Census Bureau, data has shown that working communities with multifamily dwellings actually helps increase property values. And it actually has higher property values. The single family homes near these spaces have higher property values than working communities without them. So that's actually the opposite. And the average value of single family residential homes was highest in working communities with multifamily unit opportunities. And then also the myth that density in multifamily housing is too expensive to build or accommodate. That's definitely a myth that we hear a lot. However, if you compare the price of a single family home and the price per unit of a multifamily dwelling, the price is actually much lower in the multifamily dwelling. So for example, if you are developing, a lot in are choosing between a multi-family housing project or a single family home, that, let's say quadplex is the multi-family housing project that you're doing. The quadplex is going to have more affordable options for buyers because the units are going to be cheaper versus a full single family home. And so again, the quadplex is going to provide more opportunities for people with different socioeconomic statuses to be able to afford to live there or rent there versus having to rent a single family home or buy a single family home. All right, so what are the opportunities? So with mixed, oh, no. Sorry, here we go. There we go. So mixed use development, so important to neighborhoods because again, it helps create access to amenities and helps increase quality of life. And you can walk to a resource, walk to a space, walk to a business. It makes life more enjoyable. It also can help create and promote healthier communities because when you're walking more, your community is healthier and stronger. It also helps with affordability, more opportunities and more housing options. And we have these smaller units that people can buy and rent versus again having to purchase or rent a full single family home. And it also can create opportunities for density to come in without intensity and really come in and fit and align with the scale of the neighborhood. It also helps to save costs as well. So in allowing for mixed use allows for like these great amenities like corner stores and coffee shops to be integrated among housing. I think we're all familiar with Culture Coffee and love that space so much. And it's just so wonderful that people again can walk straight from their home right in the neighborhood and enjoy a nice cup of coffee, come to a cultural space and have community. And in many areas of OKC, even though they are zone mixed use, it doesn't mean that the market would necessarily support the retail or the mixed use. So again, density is a really important factor here. And so it's just so amazing to have like the Culture Coffee and other small shops that can fit right into a neighborhood. Yeah, so, and this also right here on your screen is an example called Gun Barrel Center. So Culture Coffee is a smaller sort of mixed use example, and then also it can be scaled to a higher intensity as well, depending on the context of an area. And we see, you know, areas in south of 8th that actually could probably accommodate that mixed use scale, maybe along 4th Street, as we know historically that 4th Street was a commercial corridor that had a higher intensity of that type of development, of commercial development. So there's opportunities to bring it in on a smaller scale and a larger scale, and to bring in these amenities to a neighborhood. All right. So connecting retail, commerce, and housing in a focus areas. Now we're gonna kind of wrap it up by talking about how all of this can be connected. And discussing connectivity, not just internally with the neighborhood area, but also externally to other areas of a community. So streets, as we all know, are essentially the connective tissue between housing and retail and many mixed use developments. In our last session, we looked at a little bit of how these public networks, these streets, could be improved through ecology. And when we think about retail, commerce, and housing in any aspect of a neighborhood, these elements, streets, connectivity, are so critical and are highly dependent on the availability of having these connected streets or pathways to different areas and to also outside of the area. So here are some examples of how streetscapes can be designed thoughtfully to not only connect this type of development internally, but again, help create opportunities for people to access outside areas in different parts of our city as well. And also really promotes, you know, this quality experience of shared streets and walkability in the adjacent areas and beyond. And when streets are not just for cars and are also for people, it creates again these experiences that make us want to go outside, that makes us want to go out and shop and walk and come together and explore different areas of a community. Examples of that. And also here's some examples of how, how alleyways, which typically are treated kind of as like these forgotten spaces, can be activated to help connect other areas of the site and enhance again our experiences of being outside while promoting walkability and being able to connect to different areas. And if most people could get to or from another place by walking, I think they would choose to, especially if they had a fun experience and an interesting experience like we see here in these photos. And that would not only promote more activity, vibrancy, and connection in the neighborhood, but could also, again, have positive effects as it relates to health and quality of life and more. And I do believe if more people had the option to walk and not have to drive to every place they have to go, that they would choose to walk if they have the ability to do so. But most of our neighborhoods, unfortunately, are not designed that way. So, all right, so kind of closing out here, connections, again, it's so important to ask ourselves throughout this visioning process and this engagement process, how is the South of 8th area interconnected internally, and how do these opportunities, or how can we create opportunities for people to be able to connect outside of the community as well? And based on the previous plans and connection opportunities, we can look for these opportunities for this area to be reconnected like it once was, and strengthen its sense of place in the community and as a whole. And so this map here shows different connections. So major connections that we see here in the orange, acting as spines and major thoroughfares. We also have pedestrian connections that are more at the human scale. We see these corridor connections that are looking toward the future and the retail options on 4th Street. And the transition zones are like these buffer-like areas between the established neighborhood of Onion Health Sciences Center and the highway. So these are all opportunities here that we want to be thinking about this connectivity throughout the process of bringing in housing and commerce and retail. All right, so we are going to take a 10-minute break before we begin our panel discussion, and we will resume and hear from our panelists this afternoon, or this afternoon, yeah, still afternoon. Thank you, guys. All right, everyone, welcome back. Give a minute or so for people to get back online. That 2 minutes went by fast. Okay. Welcome back, welcome back. More straight. Like me.
What
The
do you
folk-
mean?
we're going into the panel,
Yeah,
so I won't be the
probably
focus.
not, right? Can't point it to make it more straight onto the screen.
Does it not have all the other people's?
Well, the focus will be the panelists that are on
On the
Zoom,
screen, right?
on Zoom, like their image.
Good.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone got to have a nice little 10-minute break. And I'm super excited to transition into this segment of our session today because it's featuring our panel discussion led by tactical committee members who bring in a plethora of experience and expertise to this conversation about housing, retail, and commerce. So please help me welcome our panelists for the day, committee members Greg McGee, Valenthia Doolin, Julie Coffey, and Sandino Thompson. You can like do an applause emoji or something if you want to welcome them. But welcome everyone, and thank you all so much for joining this discussion today. So I wanted to start off, I think we have all of our, yeah, everybody's on screen, great. I wanted to start off by inviting each of you just to spend a minute or two to introduce yourselves to the committee and to our audience online. and share a little bit about your background as it relates to today's topic of retail, commerce, and or housing. So I will turn it over to Sandino to kick us off.
Hey, hello everybody. My name is Sandino Thompson, and I think I'm on this panel because I'm a community developer. I have participated in some of the commercial real estate development that's taking place in Northeast Oklahoma City. Been a long time participant in Northeast Renaissance since it's starting. So just been pretty engaged in the efforts to bring redevelopment, more economic activity to Ward 7 and to the Northeast side in particular. I've done some commercial development, done some housing development on the Northeast side, or primarily on the Northeast side, and then a background in engineering, construction management. Since I moved back to Oklahoma City, I grew up in Oklahoma City, was born here, raised here, attended Oklahoma State University, moved away for a while. And since I moved back, just been trying to apply what I know to these redevelopment efforts. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Sandino. Valenthia?
Thank you. So glad that you guys asked me to be a part of this entire process, including the panel today. My name is Valenthia Doolin. I am currently Homeownership Director with the Oklahoma Housing Finance Agency. And we are a public trust nonprofit organization that provides housing opportunities throughout the state of Oklahoma, both in single family housing and in financing for multi-dwelling developments, with our focus being on creating avenues for affordable housing. My career has been centered around financing housing, both individual financing for individuals who want to become homeowners, and also around the design of helping to finance development projects for communities. So many of the projects that are in Northeast Oklahoma City, for example, are projects that I was a part of finding or administering the financing for those things to happen, whether they were developed by the Urban League or church group or some of the other groups that have developed some of the affordable housing there. And so that's what I do. My desire is to help communities and individuals understand the importance of housing stability, and then to help individuals within our group of folk who look like us begin to take on the roles of developing and designing and financing housing that is important to us, and ensuring that we are getting what we need out of the process and that we understand the process. I think for me, the biggest issue has been for over 30 years as I've watched and helped people to finance either as individuals or as organizations, is lack of preparation. And so my goal is to help groups like this and individuals learn the process and learn to implement ways that we can help people be prepared for the process so that we get the right results we want.
Thank you, Valenthia. Julie?
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. And I'm also, very honored to be a part of this panel. And I believe I was asked to participate for my current work with Ground Root Development, which is a local residential development company that has a heart for Northeast Oklahoma City. I've come to Oklahoma by way of Texas. I'm a graduate of the University of Texas with an architectural engineering degree. And with that, I have worked as a structural design, building, commercial, retail, as well as medical facilities. So design in that aspect. And then later with the MBA, I moved into project management. So again, project management for commercial, retail, and public. I was a part of the MAPS 2 project, which was MAPS for Kids. I was a project manager there for working on that project for about 9 years. And that was a great introduction to Oklahoma City. I've been a resident for some 23 years and a resident of Oklahoma for over 30 years. So I was also a 10-year business owner, had my own consulting firm and project management. And at that time, I officed in Northeast Oklahoma City. I was an active member with the Northeast Renaissance Group. And that gave me a passion for the Northeast Oklahoma City community. So I appreciate being a part of this entire process. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And last but not least, Mr. Greg McGee.
Well, I guess it's still morning. Good morning to everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to sit on the panel. I'm a commercial banker. I'm employed by Bank of the West, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of BNP Paribas out of Paris, France. I've been a commercial banker in this community for over 40 years. I have focused a lot of my time on efforts in Northeast Oklahoma City. I'm president of Central Urban Development, Inc. We've done a substantial amount of development in the area, down in the lower JFK. We've also built multifamily housing and single family housing, both market rate and for low to moderate income. We've utilized low income housing tax credits through the Oklahoma Housing Finance Agency. We've just been a fixture here. We're one of the largest landowners in Northeast Oklahoma City, and we continue to do everything we can to develop housing as well as commercial opportunities to bring back everyday conveniences that have been missing for a long time. And hopefully we can continue with this effort to do those same things. We don't all have to do the same exact thing, but the more people, the more organizations we have doing development, it's going to benefit the entire community. So.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to all of our panelists again. So as you all can see, this is about to be a really great discussion. We're going to hear about these rich perspectives and experiences. So I'm super excited to get the discussion started. And I wanted to start off with the topic of housing and ask our panelists on essentially just kind of generally hearing what you feel like is the state of housing and whatever angle you kind of want to take that in. But what do you generally feel like is the state of housing in Northeast OKC today? Julie, from your perspective, I would love to hear from you and some of the challenges that you see as it relates to housing development on the east side, and anyone else who would like to chime in on that as well. But what is your general understanding or thought on the state of Northeast OKC housing?
Okay, well, generally, Northeast Oklahoma City, we've, our group has actually looked at the generalities and the current conditions. And research shows that 35% of home, there's only a 35% home ownership in Northeast. And this tract we're talking about from Lottie to North Bryan and from 16th Street to East Reno. So that's pretty much our tract of interest. And so only 35% is home ownership. So that leaves 65% that is renters. And that can be problematic in that it can reduce the housing stability. And so when we look at that, we are big believers in what we saw earlier in the presentation. I love that term. I wasn't familiar, missing middle housing. So we're big believers in in a neighborhood being economically diverse, culturally diverse, we're believers in that, to make it a rich neighborhood. You know, children, I'm a product of that. I'm a first generation college student or college grad. And I lived in a neighborhood, it was a Black neighborhood that had doctors and teachers and attorneys and councilmen and women living in that neighborhood. So I benefited from having those kind of mentors and role models right next door to me. And so that's what we see as a challenge, to attract the economically diverse families and individuals to come in and move. And one of the reasons why that's a difficulty, one, you know, that only 35% home ownership is distracting, but also the lack of amenities and services. Again, we saw that in the presentation. That makes for a rich neighborhood and a rich community, and that doesn't exist at this time. So we see that as a problem. I'll just add one other when we talk about challenges, and I'll make this very personal to Ground Root Development. We are working with CURA, the Oklahoma City Urban Renewal Authority, and just going through that process is definitely a learning curve. So that has slowed down our progress. So it's been a challenge, even working through that. There are some benefits, of course, to working with them, in that the property or lot cost is reduced, but there's a big challenge as far as the learning curve, and that definitely affects and impacts your progress as a developer. And lastly, affordable homes. There is such a need, and that's statewide, nationwide, but that is a challenge just to make that happen at this time, given the current pandemic conditions and things like that. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow, 35% home ownership in Northeast OKC. I did not know that statistic. Thank you for sharing that data. And yes, the Missing Middle and Housing book, great resource, highly recommend. And I was actually flipping through it earlier this week, and it was talking about how a lot of news and media and like data reports focus on these larger municipalities and super urban areas like LA, New York, Chicago, and how unaffordable housing is in these cities. It actually stated, I believe, 90% of US counties do not have enough affordable housing. People who work minimum wage jobs, even at full time, cannot afford to live in most American cities. So that was pretty mind-blowing and opening to me. And I really appreciated hearing your perspective and what you see in Northeast OKC. Would anyone else like to add to the state of housing in Northeast OKC and what their general thoughts are on that? All right. Valencia, I wanted to ask you a question as a housing. Oh. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I just, I see the raised hands go. Thank you. I think, let me kind of work through a few questions and we're gonna open up for Q&A at the end so we can make sure we get as many people as possible and hear as much from our panelists. So if you don't mind, continue to chat, continue to drop in questions, and we'll address them towards the end. But Valencia, as a housing professional and resource provider, what are some of the common gaps or barriers that you see people struggling with to secure safe and healthy housing or home ownership in general? You mentioned earlier, one of the biggest issues you see is just sort of lack of preparation, but we'd love to hear you expand on what are some of those barriers that make it difficult for people to secure housing in this community?
Sure. So interestingly enough, these barriers for Black and Brown communities haven't changed very much, right? So if you think about common films or playwrights, that sort of thing, I want you to think A Raisin in the Sun. Lorraine Hansberry play in the early 50s. And the censor of that play was talking about home ownership and how important it was and how we needed to work to achieve it as a family because it was crucial to our development. And so we've known this for quite some time. And the barriers that we had in the 50s are the barriers that we now have in 2022. This is very interesting. They really have not changed. James has seen this. We've all seen this. You can build all day long, but if you don't have people who are prepared to take advantage of financing opportunities, then the building is for naught. And so part of what it's a dual process, right? I think it's lovely that we have a tremendous number of people who are interested in building affordable housing in Northeast Oklahoma City. I think that's great. I think there are some particular opportunities in Northeast Oklahoma City that have to do with not only building, but also acquisition and sort of a remake of stuff that's already there, right? We have plenty of processes and plenty of houses in Northeast Oklahoma City that are available that really need acquisition and rehab. So we need to be thinking about that. Northeast Oklahoma City is a unique area because they have so many different opportunities for accessory dwelling units that you don't see in a lot of other areas that I think could be really great from a developer's perspective. But in terms of the preparation, here's what I see. Over the years, we have a number of government, if you will, lending initiatives that are designed to help people be able to buy that first house, that are designed to address the number one barriers to homeownership for folks who are of color. The number one barrier to homeownership is the lack of resources for down payment and closing costs. So we now have loan products that have lower requirements for down payment, and we have products that provide grants for down payment and closing costs. But still, we don't have a rise in homeownership among these populations. And so then we ask ourselves, well, we've created these products, but the numbers of homeownership still aren't going up. It's because we still have the other barriers. And that one of the greatest barriers is lack of preparation. We are not prepared financially to become homeowners because we have not focused on that. So I like to say often that we give what we know, we teach what we understand. So for example, credit. It is a critical part of being able to finance homeownership. Most of us don't learn about credit in our communities until we are adults, primarily because our parents, if they knew it, didn't know to teach it to us, or it didn't matter if they knew it, right? Because even in the early 50s, early 60s, which would have been when most of our parents were doing their thing in their early 20s, right? Even if they had great credit, it didn't mean that they could be financed. It didn't mean that they could be financed to purchase a home in a community like Northeast Oklahoma City. And so therefore it became information that was not important to translate because it did not matter. And now we have an entire generation, 2 generations of people who do not understand the significance, the importance of financial preparation because we've not translated that information well. And so when the developers, like the folk that you have on the panel, build these great structures and these great houses, and they're aesthetically pleasing and they're affordable and they're all those things, but nobody can buy them because they're not prepared financially to meet the standard. And so one of the approaches over the years has been, well, the lenders need to massage the standard. This is true to some degree, but it's never going to be the case where the lenders massage the standard to the point where there is no standard. There's always going to be some standard that we have to meet. And so I think a huge part of the connection in a community like Northeast Oklahoma City, many others too, but since we're talking Northeast Oklahoma City, we got to have some folk who are interested in helping people prepare to be able to become homeowners. That is the piece in our community that is missing. And yes, we have many agencies who provide home buyer education and all of that stuff where people can get the classes. It is more than that. We really need organizations or individuals who are committed to helping people become prepared. One of the things that I do personally, it's a personal ministry of mine, is to help individuals by developing for them a mortgage readiness action plan. We need organizations and people in our communities who are committed to doing that. For anybody who says and raises their hand and says, you know what, I'd like to buy a house someday. Now what do I do? We need organizations and people who are willing to take the time, sit with that person, develop a sincere, concrete mortgage readiness action plan that has them seeing home ownership in their future and helps them to prepare for it. Now, that's just one aspect of what I see. Obviously, you know, there are tons of things that are gonna have to be done to make all of these things possible. But I think that we have a number of resources that can create the affordable housing structure. We have that. We have tax credit financing. We have subsidy financing. We have all of those things in place to help developers focus on developing affordable housing. What we are missing is the element that helps our folks be prepared to take advantage of the opportunities once they come. So in Northeast Oklahoma City, one of the things that you see, James, Greg will probably laugh when I say this, there's one particular developer that, you know, people sort of fell in love with in Northeast Oklahoma City. He was doing what they wanted them to do. And I won't call names here, right? But part of what happened in that development was we built all this affordable housing, and then nobody could buy it. So then they became what? Rental units. And I submit to you that that was the plan from the very beginning, because there was no process or effort put into preparing individuals to be able to make the purchases. So we had all these properties that were ultimately subsidized for the builder in terms of building them, but there was no effort on the other end to prepare people to be able to take advantage of them and actually purchase them. So I think that that's the missing element for us. And I think that that's what we should be focused on if we really want to see home ownership numbers increase in this area. I
Wow.
hope that answers the question. That was a long
Yeah, no.
diagram, but I hope it answers your question.
I just want to snap my fingers. This conversation is already just on fire. That was a whole word. Thank you, Olympia. We're all in here just like, yes, yes. Class on this. Between Julie and Olympia's responses, we are just in here just so appreciating that. Thank you so much. So now we're going to transition over to commerce and retail. And today we've covered essentially a discussion about how important it is for amenities like commerce and retail and what that brings to a neighborhood is to a complete neighborhood, and how these uses and their proximity, not just the use, but the proximity and integration into a neighborhood is critical to the quality of life for residents. And so Greg, I want to kind of turn it over to you, and from your perspective and experience as someone who has worked on these type of projects in the past and currently, why do you feel like it's been challenging for Northeast OKC to have amenities like other parts of Oklahoma City? We kind of discussed a little bit of that today, but for example, areas and districts like the Plaza, Paseo, Uptown 23rd, you know, these are areas that have these thriving commercial corridors, all of these amenities, and right within a neighborhood, but it seems like Northeast OKC is lacking that. Why do you feel like that's been a challenge in the community?
Well, that's something that goes back to, it's a systemic process, okay? You got to know for years, throughout segregation, Blacks were limited to a specific area, okay? And once the walls of segregation came down, we began to leave the areas that we were confined to, okay? And then what was left behind to some degree became blighted, you know, where we used to shop, where we used to work, where we used to get our services. These businesses failed because we started going somewhere else, okay? And now here we are in 2020, and we're trying to figure out how do we come back and redevelop this area where it's challenging. When you start talking about affordable housing is a term that, you know, sometimes we misuse it. Affordable housing is based on what you can't afford. Okay. We just said 35% in this designated area, 35% of the houses in this area, they're owned. That means that there's 65% that's leased. Well, leasing isn't always bad. Okay, it's just the quality of the housing. Now, to do top quality affordable housing, it's difficult to do without a subsidy because bricks and mortar and everything that make up a home costs the same to build in Edmond as it does in Northeast Oklahoma City. Okay, now let's put some things in perspective. There are a lot of agencies out here that provide housing services. I think one is that I can think of right off the top of my head is Community Action. They help with homeowner buyer education and housing counseling. It's just that we got to find these services. The services and groups are out there, but we as individuals, we've got to prepare. You just can't wake up one day and say, I want to be a homeowner. Okay, that's a fallacy. I will tell you, for example, the JFK project that Central Urban built, which is on 8th. All right, collectively there's 32 units. Well, we put in a mechanism for everybody who lives there to become homeowners. All right, we said if you rent from us, okay, and our compliance period is 15 years. If you're there at the end of 15 years, we give you so much credit for every year that you're there. Then we agree to sell you the unit or the house that you live in for no more than 70% of the appraised value. So you take two sums of money. If you can't qualify, shame on you because you got built-in equity. Okay, these are the creative types of things that organizations like Central Urban is doing to promote home ownership. Now, in this same area, one of the challenges is housing stock, and there are a lot of builders in this group will tell you it's difficult to just go in and build spec housing units. It's risky. You know, you're risking a lot of resources. Look at what the price of construction is for a home right now. Okay, you know, even if you're talking about a small house, 1,200 square feet, you know, you're talking over $200,000.
That's right.
Okay, so how does someone making minimum wage, how do two people making minimum wage apply for a $200,000 home mortgage? You can get all the down payment assistance you want. You still do not qualify. You can have great credit. You still do not qualify. There's so many barriers within that process. Okay? Back to something that was said earlier. You have to plan. You know, one of the things that I preach to my children, okay, don't load yourself up with a lot of college debt. Student loans is a big barrier to African-American young homeowners. If you graduate from the University of Oklahoma and you got $80,000 worth of student loan debt, you'll never own a home. I don't care, when you're in, if you end up being a teacher or a fireman or something along those lines. There are just so many different barriers out there. Is it impossible? No, but you have to plan. Okay, it's just like borrowing money to build a house. Okay, you go to a bank. They're going to say, "Here's our criteria." They're going to want you to have some money down. Okay, and even when you buy a home, there's still challenges that you got to deal with, because if you buy a house and you're less than a 80%, if you're above an 80% loan to value, you got to buy what? Private mortgage insurance. That's another cost on top. You know, a lot of people, what I tell people is, you know, you have to understand what you can afford. That's where it starts. Okay. Understanding what you can afford. All right. If the standard, your mortgage cannot exceed 28% of your gross income, that's not where you want to start as a home buyer. Okay. Because you still got to factor in your insurance and you got to factor in your taxes. Okay. So you're going to have to ratchet that down a little bit to factor those two into it. And then if you got to end up with private mortgage insurance, you got to factor that in. So those are a lot of things that you got to look at. Now, when you talk to builders about housing stock, okay, one of the challenges is something else that we got to look at collectively as a community. Oklahoma City public school system has got to raise its standards. Okay, it's got to raise its standards, because when you're starting to talk to young families about moving to Northeast Oklahoma City, that's something that's a critical concern. You know, it's not just building building houses to bring all kind of services in. Education is important, and a lot of parents do not want their kids in Oklahoma City public school. Let's be honest. Okay, we could be on this for hours and hours and hours, but if you break it down to its lowest common denominator, the first thing when you start talking about housing, what type of housing stock is available? You know, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this area, some of it's infill, some of it's removing housing to come back with brand new housing. Okay, all right. I heard someone talk about going in and rehabbing a lot of the housing stock that exists. On the surface, that's a good idea, but let me tell you, when you start doing major renovations, you got to bring that house back to current codes. And sometimes trying to do that is more expensive than tearing it down and building it from the ground up. Okay, so that may not be the most viable alternative for older housing stock. It's older for a reason, and some of it needs to be just torn down. You can't save everything. I was reading an article about that the other day. You can't save a lot of the older houses in the community. They're too far gone. All right. Another challenge: how many new housing subdivisions currently exist in Northeast Oklahoma City? Can anybody answer? How many subdivisions? Subdivisions for new housing stock. How many exist in Northeast Oklahoma City today?
Zero.
Zero. You know, those are the kinds of challenges that developers are looking at. Yeah, we can come in and selectively do some infill and things of that nature. Okay. But even that's a challenge. Okay. I know I've been rambling a bit, but hopefully I made some points that you understand. It's not easy. And one of the things that major retailers, and we brought up the subject of retailers, one of the first things they look at is housing stock. They look at how many units exist within a certain parameter of the areas where they like to put their facilities. Okay. And, you know, that's been a challenge because Northeast Oklahoma City to some degree is fragmented. Okay. We don't just have a central core of housing and then we build around that and we keep looping. Okay. So those are the kinds of things that we run up against. Those are the challenges that developers face. Those are the challenges that retailers face. So, we've got to be real creative on how we build housing stock. And I'm a major proponent of mixed use housing and mixed use communities. And we've tried to do that to some degree.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was so informative, and it was really insightful to hear you walk through the barriers and the process and what people really have to consider as it relates to housing and opportunity on the east side. I actually have like a whole list of questions, but we have a lot of questions in the chat that I want to make sure that we get to. I have one more for Sandina, and then I'd like to open it up for our Q&A. Again, this is great, and thank you all so much for this amazing insight. So Sandina, you've worked and have been part of multiple projects in a really successful commercial retail revitalization project in Northeast OKC, East Point. I know we're all super familiar and adore this space. An award-winning redevelopment project in Northeast OKC right on 23rd Street, which was really a unique and innovative model. And I'd love for you to walk us through what was your role in that project? And from your perspective, what are some of the challenges that might come with that type of development? And maybe why do we not see this type of development be more common in Northeast OKC?
So I'm gonna be conscientious of the fact that we're streaming this, and I'm gonna try and say things that I guess won't be too detrimental to whatever my next projects are. But I think it's also just important to be clear. Yeah. So, but I do think it's important to be clear about some of these things, and I may be pushing back a little bit on some of the typical convention. I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I'll try not to delve into housing and focus on this question. So my role in the commercial in that commercial development was as a co-developer, and I actually the conversations that started some time ago about how could we bring what we termed as inclusive and development to Northeast Oklahoma City, dealing with some of the systemic racial factors, some of the systemic discriminatory factors that we know have existed and have been talked about. So I actually partnered with developers who had who had success and had the sort of resume of doing similar type of urban infill development in other parts of the city. But we wanted to put together an inclusive structure. So, and that's going to kind of maybe be a theme of what I would talk about, actually pushes against some of the things that we when we talk, some of the challenges that we've talked about facing when it comes to redevelopment on the Northeast side and in communities of Black and brown people. And that is, sort of putting the structures in place up front that require some level of inclusivity, even when you're doing a development that is essentially driven by market forces and market factors. So what we said was we're going to take portions of our profits, portions of our fees, portions of the public assistance that we get, which is akin to the public assistance that's being provided to development projects downtown and other places. And we're going to, on the record, in public, in our pro formas, say how those things are going to be used to provide equity and inclusion for retailers who are coming in, to provide some very clear sort of opportunities for doing things that will be that can provide for community benefit, and then we're going to be very intentional about leveraging local leaders, community members, and others, and trying to identify the right kind of retail tenants to respond to the deficits in community amenities and things like that that exist. So, so my role was to sort of spearhead that and to provide some leadership for what that would look like, while working with, frankly, a group of white developers who had did these kind of developments in other parts of town, where the economics and the dynamics were a lot more beneficial and conducive.
Thank you for that insight, Sandino. All right, so we have a couple of questions for the audience I'm going to read out, and then I'm going to invite people just to unmute and chime in, since we're all primarily on Zoom, and if there's anybody in person.
Vanessa?
Oh, I'm sorry, Julie. Yeah, you want to add a comment before I open it up or ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. In the question that I addressed regarding the challenges and for development in Oklahoma City, I stated Acura, that our group had worked with the Oklahoma City Urban Renewal Authority, and that raised some questions in the chat that I wanted to just address. First of all, the working with Acura, which is an organization that that is promoting infill development or redevelopment in Northeast Oklahoma City, is a great opportunity. I did state it as a challenge, not a barrier, a challenge, in that the design and construction process can be and was for us, a learning curve. Although I have a degree in architecture engineering, I worked on maps, but it is a detailed design construction process that includes approvals at each of those phases. So for us, admittedly, even Acura shared with us, they understand it is a learning curve. So for us, for example, our first home that we designed and built, on the design side, it took more time than we expected. So of course that slowed down our process and our progress. So I just wanted to clear that up. We continue to work with Acura. They're a great team. It is a learning curve, and we've learned from that, and we're moving forward and looking much brighter as far as the upcoming projects that we have. So I hope that helps everybody.
Thank you, Julie, for that clarity and context. That's super helpful. All right, so we have a question from JD, and it states, I am curious about the panelists' views on density. Should Northeast OKC focus on single-family housing or multifamily housing? I'm seeing a contrast of views among some of our city and community leaders.
So I'd like to speak on that just from the perspective of, so even thinking about the experience of East Point and commercial real estate. So one of the things that I think has changed is that, and I think it's important for us to understand, because I think it's like a macro, it's a big picture deal that we might have opinions about, but then but in the bigger picture, like market forces that like none of us will actually be able to control. And so for a long time, like what we said about, you build housing and then the housing brings commercial development and so on and so forth, that was the case. Over the last 20 years, I think it's only continued to accelerate. There are a lot of conversations about, oh, well, this urbanization being a trend versus a sort of long-term movement, and maybe push back against suburbanization, which was a thing for about 30 years, right? So since the evolution of towns and cities being developed, like going back to Europe and Asia and other places, like mankind has been urbanized. For a period of time, with the advent of the car, particularly in the United States of America, we suburbanized, which means that both people and wealth actually intentionally moved out of urban cores and into suburban and ex-urban communities, versus those communities sort of growing in more organic ways towards each other. Over the last 10 or 20 years in Oklahoma City, in particular, and in this market, that has shifted. It's not to say that we don't have sprawl and we don't have suburban development. But I bring that up to speak to this question about density and some of these other factors, because what we have inherited in Northeast Oklahoma City, one of the reasons why we have this opportunity, all this vacant land, are the systemic hangovers of immense systemic racism, oppressive policies designed to influence where and how and why Black people could live in different places. So that's why we got so much open land. This does not exist. Even in a city with 600 square miles in Oklahoma City, doesn't exist on the other side of the railroad tracks. The way that we got this much land in South Oklahoma City was they clear cut so much stuff to build all these things with maps, right? It exists in Northeast Oklahoma City as a hangover of systemic racist issues. So when you start talking about density and what we expect, it's coming for us, like as long as people are still able to buy property with money that they own. So while we may in some instances want to see things that are less dense or may want to maintain the topography that exists. Like those things are going to come so long as private landowners can build on their land and build it in a consistent fashion with zoning codes and ordinances and what has historically been put in place. So, so when you start looking at commercial development and things like that, what they are starting to do is now drive interest. And so one of the challenges and opportunities with places like East Point, frankly, even with the success of like Paige Woodson, we start talking about, you know, sidewalk retail, like Culture Coffee and those elements, is that they are actually going to start encouraging people to want to live in places that are walkable communities, which is going to actually encourage more density. And so when we start having these conversations, I think we have to really be responsive to thinking about how we can anticipate that, and then how we can engage with those factors that are coming, because we won't be able to see new development or new community amenities this close to the urban core of Oklahoma City during a historic period of urbanization that's taking place all around the country, but definitely taking place here. So long as the economy is growing and Tinker's continuing to add jobs and we still have employment downtown, Northeast Oklahoma City is going to continue to densify. And so how we engage and interact with it, I think is just going to be critically important.
And Sandino, just kind of scaling it to our focus area, how do you feel about density in the focus area of South of 8th Street? I know Northeast OKC as a whole is a very large area, but looking at the context, the urban context of the area, being connected to or nearby adjacent to downtown, and looking at the physical location of South of 8th.
So I think with the innovation district, with some of the other things that are happening to spur economic development, just with the Health Science Center being actually the second largest locus of employment in the city next to Tinker Air Force Base, right? So we have to acknowledge that that's going to drive some things, and what's been holding it back is urban renewal's land holdings, frankly. So within this conversation, I think density is coming, and how we interact with it is important. So I think what that means is like recognizing that if we think about density, we think about some of the things that Valenti and others have said about building in structures for home ownership, and building in structures and opportunities, we can create with density different types of housing that people can step up to create opportunity for inclusiveness. I think setting those standards becomes absolutely important. And when people talk about historical context, right? So it's very interesting that we got to pick our points and times, right? So with the area of south of 8th that we're talking about, you go back, and I know that that Open Design has looked at some of this. If you go back and you look at the street grid, circa 1930s and 40s, it is much more dense than what exists today. There was actually a period of what I would say de-densification that took place. And then I think we, with redevelopment that's come back in JFK and other places, have gotten accustomed to single family, single lot housing. But prior to cars being something that were required in order to get around transportation wise, we had streetcars, we had bikes, and people had to walk. And these areas around south of 8th were communities where people had to either bike or walk, oftentimes to get to where they were going, whether it was employment in Bricktown, employment downtown, or other places. So we just got to think about those urban forms. And if we're talking about historical context, I don't think it can just be the housing stock that's been built in the past 20 or 30 years, but I think it needs to be like the actual urban fabric and environment of this community, because density going up and density fitting more things on smaller lots can create more affordable opportunities for people to either stay in place or for people to engage. And it'll create more, it'll create more options for us to create different types of housing that folks with different income levels and other barriers can engage with. Because in Oklahoma, we're an impoverished state, whether people want to accept it or not. We made a lot of strides over the last 20 years, but you look at any data about income levels and things like that, the United States has a wage problem. Right, but in Oklahoma we have even a larger wage problem, because you can't build quality housing new for probably less than $115 a square foot, right? And so when you start looking at those dynamics, like going back to the points that others were making, the only way to fix that is you got to have huge subsidy to buy down that cost, or you got to deal with wages, and you have to deal with sizes, and you have to deal with housing types.
Thank you, Sandino. I think I see a question from Yatham, that might be a follow-up to this discussion. Yatham, I'm going to turn it over to you and invite you to unmute, ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandino. beautiful explanation. I am very curious about learning on why the homeownership is so dismal on the Northeast side. I think we all have sort of the assumption, and some of you have experiences from personal interaction with the communities. So I was suggesting doing a robust study of that, conducting a survey. I know we are overly surveyed. The reason I say that is because it creates the solution from that, right? The way of thinking about housing structure as it is today, we, the designers, we, the developers, creating a solution for those that are needing it is not a model that works, because that's the model that we've been working and functioning with. So how do we sort of flip the narrative and allow and give the community and how they can imagine this home ownership? For me, I really would like to take you back to a movie by Spike Lee, Do the Right Thing. I don't know if how many of you have watched that film. It has been a movie that I'm revisiting over and over again. In that movie, there are a group of men sitting outside of a convenience store, 4 men, talking about what they could do in a sense of developing a space. And they are ridiculing one another, right? They are seeing all the progress that was happening on that film. There's the Korean store making money in there, and the Italian dude, ownership pizzeria. So they were really aware of their problems. They knew they were fixing it, but nobody gave them the opportunity. To me, these are amazing land developers. They're keenly aware and knew their social problems. So, so we cannot depend on this sort of older model where we, the professionals, will solve the issues. But I think we have. I would like to challenge and ask us: how do we create that space to allow full participation from those that don't have home in those areas? And based on the information we gather from there, maybe that could also create the solution. Again, whether it's called high density or whatever have you, the solution lies within that. And I don't think it's just affordability. I mean, I think if we all could talk about how we first purchased our homes and the nightmares that we thought we can no longer do it. I mean, that belief, that mind shift has to occur. We have to change our own vernacular to becoming homeowners. I owned mine 6 years ago, and I will tell you, it was the most bothersome thing that I could have ever done. And Graves said it well, but student loan, man, I did not care. I just jumped right in, right? So without rumbling way too much, I would say is that we need survey, collect the data, and use the data to create a new way of imagining homeownership for those that don't have it.
Thank you, Joachim, for sharing that perspective and idea. I'm going to go ahead and read another question that we have from the audience, from Ashley, that states, if we're going to prioritize density and missing middle housing typologies that we saw in the presentation today, my question is, how do we support thoughtful designs that integrate seamlessly into the existing historically correct styles and avoid disruptive infill designs that exist wholly in new suburban developments? And I will just kind of give a preface that we are going to cover this topic of aesthetics and culture and design in our last session in this reflection education phase of the project. So more to come on that, but yes, opening that up to the panelists and anyone who would like to speak on how do we be thoughtful about design and aesthetics and make sure it aligns with the character of a neighborhood in the focus area. We can focus in on South Bay.
Vanessa, I'll start by saying that is one of the aspects that the Acura process has attempted to address, in that they have compiled a design standard, and that design standard takes into consideration the historic architectural styles. And so that's part of the design process to identify the historic architectural styles existing in your area of infill, so that you can complement those. You can, you know, agree with those styles. So, and not, you know, that's just one way, and maybe we can build on what they have done. I know their study for that was done over 10 years, well, nearly 10 years ago. I've forgotten the date. I think it's 2012 maybe, and that they actually had an outside consulting firm come to the city and the area, which was the greater part of Northeast Oklahoma City, not just our area of interest. And so from that information that the consultants gathered, they compiled design standards. And so that is part of our contract with them to comply with those design standards. So that's I think a model that perhaps we can work from and create something that works for us.
So
Can I jump into this for a second and make a comment? Are we getting an echo?
Yeah.
yeah,
Cindy,
All
then
right.
you can try, Gina's actually coming up to make a comment.
okay, and yeah, because and this won't take long, because I think to answer the question, I just want to point us to other examples of what exists. So the only way to address that question that was brought up is to have a design overlay district and create standards. So Okira has those requirements for land they own. But if I own land, I can build essentially whatever I want next to it, as long as it fits within the scale and the scope of the zoning regulations. So truthfully, like even with Okira or with this development exercise, I think we just have to recognize the market itself. And so a design overlay district, like what exists in Heritage Hills, for example, right, will say what types of forms and things of that nature that you can have. And that has to go through a process of review. Alternatively, I'll point you actually to Creston Hills as an example of a place where we just have to be very clear and maybe cautious about what we're calling historical or what we're calling right size or right scale. Because in Creston Hills, you have at least 3 different distinct forms and types of housing that were built over a period of time. And I don't know like how you would pick which one is the most correct, because you have the sort of shotgun, like typical 700 to 800 square foot style of housing that was built right after World War II. And then as that community developed and as more people moved in with more capability, they had the brick style A-frame housing that came alongside it, right? So, and that to me makes a community a little more, makes it more interesting and more complete. So design guidelines themselves, I think you have to have an overlay if you want to have the community have true influence on what private landowners are able to do with their property.
Thank you.
Outside of that, I think we just have to also be very conscientious about what we're calling right and what we're calling the right or historical forms of property.
So I
Correct.
just want to jump in real quick, just in the spirit of transparency as well. Vanessa mentioned earlier, she talked about the revamping of our codes. We know this area, we've already gone through the land use study. And now planning's efforts are focused largely on trying to go to a form-based code system so that we don't have to have those design overlays. Just as, and Sandino is right, that's the best way to try and control the aesthetics and make sure that we integrate seamlessly within the housing stock or the character of the neighborhood. You can specifically create a district that addresses all of those issues. And those are the types of things that you really are going to be informing. But it's very important, I think, in the spirit of transparency, that you understand that that process is potentially changing. We're trying to make embed those characteristics within the base code. What that means then, though, is that once that code change has actually been accomplished, that entitlement will go with that land. And so in this process, it's going to be very important to identify what type of character do you want, and what are the different alternatives. It may not be one particular style, as Sandina has just talked about. You may be talking about multiple styles that you can choose from, or but the point being that in this process, the information that you provide concerning character, concerning the building heights, how far the setbacks are, you know, whether or not it's a single family home, or it's a quad, or it's a duplex. When you take those individual lots, and if you look at all of those Okura lots, and lot by lot determine, do I want this to be affordable? Do I want this to be market rate? Understanding that the dynamics of the mix of all of these different types of housing typologies. The information that you provide is the information that's going to go back to planning. And as that code changes, that characteristic will be embedded in the code so that you do not have to go to an overlay district.
Can I say something?
I want to make sure that everyone understands that.
I know we're a little bit short on time, and so I want to just address this because this is my question. That I totally agree. I think we're talking about the how we sort of do something like this, and I think more importantly for my question is the why. Why would we want to look at something like this and be intentional? One of the benefits of working at the Neighborhood Alliance is having the opportunity to sort of work with over 600 neighborhoods in Central Oklahoma, and it also gives me opportunity to benchmark successes in other neighborhoods. And so when I go and talk about, I think the attention to architecture design is actually going to be one of the solutions to sort of sell density. Because when I talk to some of these core urban neighborhoods about density, they sort of give me the NIMBY, right? Not my backyard. But then when I point out to them that you do already have density. When I'm in Jeff Park, when I'm in medical community, they don't realize that they have density because those architectural, those fourplexes and eightplexes integrate so seamlessly into their current architectural designs. They're not even aware that it's there. And so I think one thing about Creston Hills, I know they have different typologies there, but what I do know is they don't have a Dallas style snot house. I know that what is that song? One of these things are not like the other. I think we're pretty clear that that does not fit. And so as we continue to work towards this, I think from a neighborhood perspective, it's really important for us to understand when you live in a community and you see something being built in the community, if it is not integrated well into your community, it sends a very clear message that, this is sort of the next phase of what my neighborhood looks like, and I'm not a part of it. Whereas, some of our more valuable neighborhoods in Jefferson Park, Heritage Hills, medical community, Lincoln Terrace, have density that has integrated seamlessly into their community. It provides the same outcome with more intentionality for the design. And I think as we continue to inform this process, that's a way we can be innovative, creative, and not create as much disruption as could possibly happen in Northeast Oklahoma City. Because already over all of these years, what you see when you see these different sort of housing styles that have developed over these years, those are scars, right? And so of unintentional design, haphazard design. And so although all of those styles are there, we can choose because we know historically what should have been there. And I say it all the time, our goal is to provide these neighborhoods with the futures they should have had if they were not demolished. And so I just encourage us to be thoughtful about how we continue to build.
Ashley is, I mean, you're right on. I think this is such a key and important topic. And for the reasons that she has identified. And it's not, we're not the only community in the nation that is struggling with these issues. Many communities are having the same type of challenges, i.e. we have a lot of communities that have been dismantled. We have a lot of opportunities for infill developers or development, and developers are taking advantage of that. But they are building without guidelines, and therefore you have it's sort of a disenfranchisement, a further disenfranchisement of the existing communities. And this is happening not just in Black and Brown communities. This is happening in all the Anglo-Saxon communities as well. And people who want to age in place, they feel married to their land. They intend to pass on their homes to the next generation. And so all of a sudden, they've got a 1,200 square foot home, bungalow style home, and then someone builds in the lot next to them a 5,000 square foot home that looks like it should be in the suburbs. And so how have they begun to address that? And the strategies that they've used to address that have been these overlay districts that then say, sure, you can come in and put this 5,000 square foot home, but this characteristically is what it needs to look like so that it marries seamlessly within the fabric of the existing community.
So
Now, in our study area, so much has been raised, if you will, it's gone, that you don't have you don't have as much to try or tie into. So you do have an opportunity to build according to today's standards, if that's the desire of the community. If it is not, it's important then to establish, what do we want it to look like? Do we want to take on the characteristics of, say, 50 years ago, or do we, what do we want that fabric to look like aesthetically? So
I just want to say one thing, because I appreciate Ashley's clarification, and I think that the sentiment of this is super important, right? So I think but I really just want to make sure we're staying centered back to like what the actual output is. So when I was talking about overlays and those kind of things, so form-based code is great, but actually form-based code won't determine whether my building should, whether my housing that I build as new construction should be built with brick, should be built with siding, or whether I encase it in marble, because that's just what I'm excited about, right? And whether it has 3 peaks in it and hips and valleys in the roof, or whether it's a flat roof, or whether it's a slanted roof, right? So like the only way to dictate the actual design that private developers will do is either to have is in this case, Okura owned property. But even within the context of what we're talking about here, that's only a portion of the property. But then the only way to dictate sort of those types and forms is with a design overlay. And I think it's an important thing to take away, because alternatively to that, we do have communities. Let's say Lincoln Terrace. Maybe Crescent Hills is a bad example because of the size of the house. But in Lincoln Terrace, I can build 1,500 square foot bungalow, or I can build 5,000 square foot, 3-story, right? And those things actually exist next to each other. So what the thing that dictates it is actually the zoning. So whereas R1, R2, R3, et cetera, and what those forms and types. And then there's something to be said for the kinds of types that are going to have the most market sort of appeal and going to encourage some other things that we actually can inform when you start talking about setbacks and things of that nature that are going to encourage the right kinds of density, the right kind of walkability, the right kind of interaction with the street environment and those kind of things. I just want to be clear about what tools, though, can actually get the types of outputs that you want, because it's important to understand that in the context of what our expectations are for what comes from these developments. And so if we want to impact how developers will bring on their property, what they will put onto their property, we can influence it, one, by setting precedent and setting guidelines for what things look like, or two, by having actual design requirements and restrictions, right? But those are the things that are going to constrain and guide and direct the actual private market and the private sector development that happens seamlessly within the community. Happens only if we have good sort of context and good content to drive and guide it in that direction.
Thank you, Sandino. And just as a reminder, reiterate Regina was sharing, the city is moving away from the practice of design overlays. And so this here is a great opportunity for us to formulate, conceptualize, and ideate about what does this character look like? How is it defined in this community context? And what could that look like in the future? So thank you all. We are,
So that you can get it embedded.
yes, so it can be embedded into the code. Thank you, Gina. We are a little past time. I think I'll open it up for one more question. I feel like we need a part 2. I don't know if we'll be able to fit it in south of 8's schedule because we're already kind of tight, but this has been such an amazing conversation. So thank you all so much. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions today, but Yakin, I saw your hand up. Or is it clapping? Oh, he was just clapping. Okay. And I think we had one question off of our Facebook Live. I think it was regarding the 28%. I believe you spoke about this in regards to affordability. And someone asked just for like a little bit of a further explanation on that number.
Hey, what now? I think I threw that out.
Yes, Greg, I think that was you speaking.
Well, what you need to do, what a person needs to do is meet with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender is going to tell you the criteria. And I was just using 28% as an example. It's not an exact. The amount that you can qualify, it can go up or it can go down. It's just based on the totality of your income and how much you're trying to finance. But I use that as a rule of thumb. I mean, if you're spending more than 28% of your income on housing, that's a lot. Okay, that's a lot.
Got it. Well, thank you, Greg, and round of applause to our amazing panelists. This was so informative, so enlightening, such a rich conversation, and I really do feel like we're going to find a way to make a part 2, even if it's just outside of South 8. But thank you all so much. Thank you to everybody who has joined online, and we will see you in a couple of weeks for our next session, and we'll be announcing information on that soon. Thank you all and have a wonderful, safe, and warm weekend.